Welcome back to this edition of The Heat. We're discussing how China is viewed around the world. Let's get back to our panel. And Lin, let me get back to you. If we look at the last general election here in the United States, China was front and center. We heard China being mentioned in the debates. We heard China being mentioned in campaign speeches. There was a tendency during that election debate, even now, today, to blame China for this country's economic woes. Let's take a listen to some of what candidate Trump said at the time.
We will combat the counterfeiting and piracy that destroys American jobs. We will enforce the rules of fair and reciprocal trade that form the foundation of responsible commerce.
Actually, he was already elected president when he said that. But when you listen to things like that, is China getting a bad rap here?
Well, I think these are, important remarks that President Trump has been making. Trump has been playing tough on China or by giving carrots and sticks on China. Some say these are tactics that President Trump has been making when then candidate Trump was trying to win a massive support from working class in America by using these remarks. And then right now as the president, he's trying to use these as tactics as gaining his negotiating power with China in the North Korea nuclear crisis. And but despite all these, I think both the top leadership and general public in both U.S. and China are recognizing that U.S.-China relations are the most important bilateral relations in the world. And there are, mutual interest, common ground between U.S. and China. There are frictions in trade and investment between both sides. And both recognize that only through communication, through mutual understanding towards each other, that, keep continuing exploring mutual interest and common ground and working on the differences to solve the frictions that can build towards a more collaborative relationship between U.S. for mutual prosperity.
But Lin, does China have to do a little bit of a better job here of selling itself insofar as trade and commerce and economic relations are concerned to show America that there are major advantages for both sides in this relationship? It's not a one-way street. There is an advantage to all that China provides to America.
Well, I think it's true. There are huge imbalances in trade between U.S. and China. Now there are more issues on bilateral investment issues between these two sides. And a lot of complaints on the U.S. side that there is not a level playing field in China for multinational companies or for American companies to do business in China. I think both U.S. and China are working towards that issue. And as we already see, there are new rounds of negotiation between the two sides. And there are more exchange of ideas, communications between the business community on both sides. And I'm pretty sure in this new administration that both sides will work very diligently on working the new issues, because I think a lot of trade and investment issues between the two sides are emerging only recently, in recent 5 to 10 years. I believe that policymakers will find new common ground and mutual interest to solve the problems.
Right, Pepe, China has become a champion of globalization. President Xi Jinping has talked about globalization. He talked about it at the World Economic Forum. Has, in a sense, China taken away that mantle of free trade, of globalization, away from the United States?
To a greater extent, I would say yes. In fact, when Xi Jinping made his absolutely outstanding speech at Davos this year, most people in the room completely agreed with him. And even before his speech, they're already saying, no, the new boss is in town in terms of globalization and really integrated globalization, as the Chinese are discussing it. I'd like to come back always to the point of soft power. Local governments and Chinese companies investing all over the world, they need to refine their PR to explain extremely controversial projects, be it in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, or eventually in Europe, like the Piraeus port in Greece. I'll give you an example, for instance. In Latin America, in Brazil. Brazil now, the #1 trading partner of Brazil for the past 4 or 5 years already, has overtaken the US, is China. They're going to build a river highway like in the middle of Brazil, from central Brazil to the Amazon rainforest, in the Tapajós River. They're building 40+ dams. They're going to turn this into an enormous highway to facilitate export of soya to China. So this, in theory, is going to benefit China, it's going to benefit Brazil, their balance of payments, and it's going to benefit people who live across the Tapajós as well. But this is not explained well enough. So, and there are other companies involved as well, apart from the Three Gorges Corporation. There are Brits, there are French as well. But when we see, for instance, Western mainstream media touching on the subject, they're saying China is going to devastate central Brazil and parts of the Amazon. So it's up to the Brazilian government, whatever there is at the moment, which is an absolute mess, and Chinese companies to explain the benefits of projects like that.
Janet, talk to us a bit more about soft power and how China needs to improve. I mean, one of the metrics we've been looking at here was that China is now the 4th most visited country in the world after the United States, France, and Spain. So there's a great deal of opportunity there, isn't there, for expanding tourism, for expanding what you talked about a moment ago, people-to-people exchanges.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to suggest also that when it comes to Xi Jinping and becoming the emerging global leader on the world stage, I think that our president has actually relinquished that role, and it made it much easier for Xi Jinping to rise up on that platform. But when it comes to soft power, I see huge changes, really, from where I sit, because I've been immersed in the world of entertainment. I mean, every studio, and these studios, by the way, were just monolithic powers for decades, ever since the birth of movie making. They are now bowing to China, not in an obsequious way so much, but they have to recognize that, number one, there's tremendous amount of capital coming from China into productions, into companies, that is very much affecting the whole landscape. But this is not possible before. And also the market. The market is now the 2nd largest in the world and will surpass the US film market. This is, of course, completely unprecedented. So what does this all mean? Well, it means, first of all, that China itself is learning how to make better movies. Just in the last few months, there was a phenomenon of a movie that made $800 million in China. It's called Wolf Warrior 2. And interestingly enough, apropos to this conversation, it's set primarily in Africa. And it's about this kind of rogue special ops type person who saves a lot of people when there's a rebel uprising in Africa. And he saves both Chinese and Africans. He actually befriends a young African child in the course of this. And so that is the new face. You know, it's very much of a Rambo-style hero who is Chinese. We've never really seen that before. And while this film is not necessarily playing well around the world, I think it's an indication of what's to come. In other words, the techniques and tools that Hollywood has been so adept at using in the past are now being used by Chinese, but with a different point of view, with different kinds of heroes. In the past, really, the heroes have always been white. And now I think Chinese are able to consider making films where the hero is not white.
Right, and Adetunji, we know that China's relationship with the rest of the world is focused largely around economic relations, trade relations, and commerce, but it's playing a role on other platforms as well. If we look at China's role at the United Nations, international policy platforms, take peacekeeping operations for one. There are now many, many Chinese soldiers involved in peacekeeping operations on the continent of Africa. How do Africans see that?
Look, we need a lot of help. I mean, you know, there are many theaters of war in Africa, in Somalia, in Mali, even in northern Nigeria. We know the Americans try to help us when the Chibok girls were kidnapped. But then we had the Lee Amendment, which says that American soldiers or the Americans will not support any military that has been fingered in committing acts of, you know, if you like, human rights abuses. So we will welcome, I mean, China is a member of the Security Council. They have a large military. They also have a lot of money. And we have too many conflicts in Africa for us to be choosing and picking who should come and help us. So we welcome Chinese. If the Chinese are helping in the economic front, and they've got military capacity, then in Africa, we welcome that. What we wouldn't welcome is any acts that denigrates Africa or where they take advantage of Africans, especially with regards to their labor laws and things like that, how they operate their businesses. That's the one that keeps Africans up at night.
Pepe, one final question, and this is about China's role in fighting climate change. Of course, China itself has been making incredible progress in green energy. It's invested something like $100 billion in renewable resources. But China and the United States led that charge in Paris when as the Paris Accord was signed. Now the United States has pulled out. So China now takes the lead, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And don't forget that China has one of the most rich green programs all across the world. This is something that most people in the West have no idea. Even in Europe, people have no idea. So Macron is working very closely with Xi Jinping. The French recognize that China now is in the forefront. They know that China is investing heavily in all sorts of sustainable energy. And once again, the United States is self-isolated vis-a-vis the major polluters in the world. That includes some of the European Union countries, Brazil, India. And you can imagine with the breadth and reach of the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative in the next few years, China will be investing all over the world more and more. Central Asia, Southeast Asia, all across Eurasia and Western Europe. And at the same time, they will be on an offensive to clear their air and invest more in their green programs. So this breadth and enormous reach of China will be felt in the next 4, 5, 6 years, even more than today, to an extent we cannot even imagine.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Pepe Escobar, Janet Yang, Lin Yang, Adetunji Omotola, thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.